Welcome to Wickless Night. There is something different about a night with no light at all, no candle burning, no lamp in the corner, just darkness, silence, and the feeling that something may be closer than it should be. Tonight's stories come from people who lived through moments they still cannot explain. A sound in an empty room, a stranger at the door, a shadow that moved when no one else was there. Before we step into the dark, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy slow, unsettling, true horror stories, subscribe to Wickless Night. Get comfortable. The lights are already gone. My friend and I were walking home from the gym when we were in 8th grade. It was already dark out, or close to it. I do not remember the exact time, but it was late enough that the streets were quiet and most people were inside. We had gone to the gym, done whatever 8th graders do when they are trying to feel older and stronger, and then started walking home. The route we normally took went near a wooded area. There was a longer way around with more streetlights and houses, but we almost never used it. The woods gave us a shortcut. If we cut through them, we could get home faster. It was one of those paths people who lived nearby knew about. Not an official trail with signs and benches, just a route worn down by kids, dog walkers, and people trying to get from one side of the neighborhood to the other. During the day, it was not that scary. It was still woods, but you could see the trees clearly. You could see the dirt path beneath your shoes, the brush on either side, and the occasional break in the trees where a yard or road showed through. It was the kind of place that felt normal because we had used it plenty of times. At night, it was different. The trees became darker than the sky. The path narrowed in places. Branches hung overhead and made the whole area feel closed in. Every sound seemed louder because there were fewer cars, fewer people, and less light around us. You could hear leaves shifting under your shoes. You could hear a branch move somewhere deeper in the woods. You could hear wind moving through the trees and not know whether it was wind or something else. But we were used to it. We were talking as we walked. I do not remember what we were talking about. Probably nothing important. School, the gym, someone we knew, a game, a joke, whatever was on our minds at the time. We were not acting scared. We were just walking home the way we usually did. Then we heard something overhead. At first, it did not sound close. It was a distant noise above us, maybe far enough away that I did not immediately think much about it. You hear things in the sky all the time. A plane can be miles away and still make enough noise to notice. A helicopter can sound strange when it is moving through clouds or passing behind trees. Even traffic from a distant highway can carry in weird ways at night, so when we first heard it, I assumed it was just a plane. The sound was somewhere above the trees. It was not loud enough yet to make us stop walking. Then everything changed almost instantly. The object came over us so fast that it did not feel like it had been approaching normally. 1 second, the sound seemed distant. The next second, something enormous was directly overhead. It was like it went from far away to right above us in less than a moment. Not gradually getting closer, not slowly moving into view the way a normal plane would. It seemed to jump across the sky. It felt like it went from 10 to 1,000 in a millisecond. I remember looking up and seeing this huge dark shape moving over the trees. It was black, not just dark because it was nighttime, but a deep, almost obsidian kind of black. It looked solid against the sky. The edges were hard to make out because of how fast it moved, but I could still see enough of its shape to know it did not look like a normal small aircraft. There was a green glow along the sides, not a blinking red and green navigation light like you would see on a plane. It seemed more like a dim greenish light running along parts of its body or wings. It was not lighting up the whole sky, but it was visible enough to make the shape stand out. That green glow was one of the details that stayed with me. The object had wings. That was why I did not think it was a creature. It had the general shape of an aircraft, but it did not look like a normal commercial plane. The wings seemed larger, wider, and more complicated. There was something about the design that looked more advanced than anything I had ever seen. At least, that is how it looked to me in that moment. It was huge. I know size is difficult to judge at night, especially when you are looking up at something moving very fast. Something high in the sky can look smaller than it is, while something low can look massive, even if it is not. Distance can completely change how your brain reads size. But it looked bigger than a 2-story house. That is what I remember. It seemed to stretch across the sky above the trees. Its wingspan looked unreal. It did not feel like a small private jet or a helicopter. It did not look like a bird, even a huge bird, because the wings did not move the way wings move. It was shaped like a plane, but not like a plane I recognized. The surface looked strange too. It was dark and almost scaly, or textured in some way. I do not mean it literally looked like animal skin, but the black surface did not seem smooth like the underside of a normal aircraft. It looked uneven. It looked layered. It looked like there were shapes along it that I could not understand because it was moving too fast. Maybe it was only the shadows. Maybe it was the green light reflecting across a dark metal surface. Maybe the trees below made the object look more textured than it actually was. But when I remember it, I still see something dark and complex moving above us. Then came the sound. It sounded like jets firing. That was the closest thing I could compare it to. Not just the distant hum of a normal airliner, not a helicopter chop, not a small engine whining overhead. It was a heavy, powerful sound that seemed to rush through the air after the object passed. It was loud enough that it made the moment feel physical. You could feel it in your chest. You could feel it in the ground, or maybe in your legs, because your whole body was tense. It did not sound like something living. That was why I never thought it was some giant creature or monster. It had wings, yes, but they looked mechanical. The sound made it feel mechanical too. If I had seen only a dark shape, maybe I would have thought it was some strange bird or an optical illusion. But the sound was too much like engines. The object shot over us and disappeared beyond the trees before either of us had time to really understand what we were looking at. For a second, I honestly wondered if I was imagining it. It happened so fast that my brain could not process it properly. I looked up, saw something massive and dark, heard the roar, and then it was gone. There was no time to study it, no time to pull out a phone, no time to point and say, "Look at that." It was just there, then gone. I stood still. My friend stood still too. Then my friend said, "What the fuck was that?" That was the moment I knew I was not alone in seeing it. I had not made it up. I had not been half asleep. I had not looked at a cloud, a bird, or a shadow and turned it into something impossible in my head. My friend saw it, too. And then my friend started running. I do not remember whether they shouted anything else. I only remember that they took off, and I followed because suddenly standing under the trees felt like the worst idea in the world. We ran, not because we thought the object was going to come back immediately, not because we had any clear idea of what danger we were in. We just had that instinctive reaction people get when something huge and unknown happens too close to them. Get out of there. Move. Go home. We ran through the path, probably faster than we had ever walked it before. The woods that had felt familiar a few minutes earlier suddenly felt too dark. Every gap between trees felt like something could be moving through it. Every sound from above made me tense. We kept looking up whenever there was enough opening in the branches to see the sky. But the object was gone. There was no green glow, no second roar, no visible trail. Nothing. Eventually, we made it out of the woods and back toward the neighborhood. The streetlights made everything feel more normal again. Houses, driveways, parked cars, porch lights, all of it came back into view. Once we were near familiar streets, the adrenaline started turning into confusion. We started talking about what we had seen. At first, neither of us could explain it well. It is hard to describe something that happens quickly, especially when both people are scared. You keep repeating the same details because those are the only things your brain held onto. It was huge. It was black. Did you see the green? Did you hear that sound? It looked like a plane. What kind of plane looks like that? We went back and forth trying to make it fit something normal. Maybe it was a jet flying low. That was the first explanation. Jets can look enormous when they pass overhead. At night, it can be difficult to judge altitude. A normal aircraft can appear much lower than it really is if you only see it for a second between trees. The sound can arrive strangely depending on wind, distance, and the direction it is flying. Maybe it was a military aircraft. That seemed possible too. A military jet might look darker than a passenger plane. It might have a different shape. It might move faster. It might sound louder and more aggressive. It might have lights that looked unusual through the trees. But it did not feel like any jet I had ever seen. I knew I was only in 8th grade. I was not an aircraft expert. I had not seen every kind of plane. I could not name models or identify military aircraft by their wing design. Still, I had seen planes before. Everyone has. You see them from car windows, from school playgrounds, from backyards while walking down the street. You know roughly what an airplane looks like when it crosses the sky. You know the shape, you know the lights, you know the speed. This looked different. It moved too suddenly. It seemed too big. The wings looked too wide and too advanced. The dark body had a strange texture, and the green light on the sides did not match what I expected to see. For a while, I wondered whether we had just been tripping, even though we were not on anything. That is the only way I can put it. Maybe we were tired from the gym. Maybe darkness distorted the shape. Maybe we got scared. Then, our memories made it larger and stranger as we talked about it. Maybe an ordinary aircraft passed low over the woods and our brains filled in the rest. That is completely possible. Human memory is not perfect, especially in moments of shock. When something moves fast, you do not record it like a camera. You catch fragments, a color, a sound, a shape, a feeling. Then afterward, your mind tries to connect those fragments into something that makes sense. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe the object was smaller than it looked. Maybe it was farther away than it seemed. Maybe the green glow was a reflection from lights on the ground, a navigation light distorted by branches, or some kind of atmospheric effect. Maybe the scaly surface was simply shadow and motion blur. Maybe the wings looked enormous because we only saw them for a second against the dark sky. Maybe it was a normal jet, but I still cannot fully accept that explanation because of how fast it appeared. The sound seemed distant, and then the object was directly over us. There was no normal approach. It did not seem to move across the sky toward us. It seemed to rush into view all at once. Maybe that was an illusion caused by the woods. We were walking under tree cover. We could not see the full sky. Maybe the aircraft was approaching for several seconds, but we only saw it when it passed through one clear opening overhead. If that is what happened, then it would make sense that it appeared suddenly. A jet could have been there the whole time, hidden by branches until the exact moment it came over the gap above us. That would explain part of it. But not all of it. The way the sound hit, the dark body, the green glow, the strange design, and the fact that both of us immediately knew it was something unusual. I do not think aliens were there. That is not where my mind goes first. I do not think a spaceship flew over two eighth graders walking home from the gym, and I do not think we were secretly visited by something from another planet. But I do not know what I saw. Maybe it was an aircraft that had not been shown to the public yet. Maybe it was some kind of military test aircraft. Maybe it was experimental technology. Maybe it was a drone or unmanned aircraft, much larger than anything I understood at the time. Maybe there was a nearby base, flight path, or training area I did not know about. All of that sounds more likely to me than aliens. But I still have no proof. We did not get a picture. We did not tell the police. We did not report it anywhere. We were just two kids walking home through the woods, and then something huge crossed over us too quickly for us to do anything except stare and run. The next day, everything was normal. Nobody around us mentioned a strange aircraft. There were no news stories that I remember. No adults talking about loud jets. No reports of something passing low over the neighborhood. Maybe it happened in a place and time where nobody else noticed. Maybe other people saw it and thought it was a normal plane. Maybe it was only strange to us because we saw it from below, under the trees, in the dark. That could be true. But whenever I think about that night, I remember how both of us reacted before we had time to talk ourselves into anything. I looked up and saw it. My friend looked up and saw it. My friend said, "What the fuck was that?" Then we ran. There was no disagreement. There was no one person saying they had seen something while the other tried to explain it away. We both knew something massive had just flown over us. Maybe it was a jet. Maybe it was a military aircraft. Maybe the darkness and speed made it look far more unusual than it really was. I am willing to believe that, but I still remember the object as something bigger than a two-story house, black as obsidian, with a green glow along its sides and wings that looked too large and sophisticated to be normal. I still remember the sound like jets firing. I still remember it going from distant to directly overhead in what felt like no time at all. And I still remember being in 8th grade, walking home from the gym with my friend, thinking we were taking our normal shortcut through the woods. Then suddenly looking up and realizing the sky above us did not feel normal anymore. When I was about 9 years old, I was home alone for a little while and watching TV. I do not remember what I had been watching. It could have been a cartoon, a movie, or some random show I had put on just to have noise in the house. At that age, it did not take much for me to get absorbed in the television. I could sit there for a long time, half watching, half playing with something nearby, barely paying attention to anything else. The house was quiet. Both of my parents were at work, and I knew I was the only one home. That was not unusual for me. I was old enough to understand the rules. Do not open the door. Do not mess with the alarm. Do not go outside unless you are supposed to. And do not let anyone in. The doors were locked. The alarm was set. Everything was secure. That mattered to me even then. I remember checking things in my head sometimes when I was alone. The front door was locked. The back door was locked. The windows were shut. The house alarm was on. My parents would be back later. Nothing was supposed to be able to get inside. I was sitting in the living room, watching the TV, probably feeling completely normal. There was no warning, no strange noise before it happened, no door opening, no sound from the hallway, no movement in another room. I was just there, in front of the television. At some point, I turned the TV off because I needed to go do something. Maybe I had to use the bathroom. Maybe I wanted a snack. Maybe I remembered something in my room. I do not remember the reason now. It was probably something small and ordinary, the kind of thing you do without thinking. I hit the power button. The screen went dark, and in the reflection of the black TV screen, I saw something standing directly behind me. It looked like a werewolf. That is the only way I have ever been able to describe it. I was not watching a werewolf movie. I was not playing a game. I had not been talking about monsters or trying to scare myself. I had simply turned off the television, and the black glass of the screen reflected the room behind me. In that reflection, there was a figure. It was tall enough that it seemed to loom over me. It had the shape of something human, at least in the way it stood, but its head was wrong. The face looked stretched or animal-like. I remember fur, or something that looked like fur. I remember the outline of ears or a snout. I remember the feeling that it was not a person. It was standing right behind me, close enough that if it had been real, it would have been only a few feet away. For 1 second, I could not move. I just stared at the reflection. The screen was dark, and the room behind me should have looked familiar. I should have seen the furniture, the doorway, the ordinary shapes of the house. Instead, I saw myself in the foreground and that thing behind me. The fear hit me all at once. I felt it in my stomach first, then in my chest, then everywhere. My body reacted before I had time to think. I remember my heart pounding so hard that it felt painful. I remember the cold rush of panic that made my arms feel weak. There is a specific kind of fear that comes from seeing something behind you. It is worse than seeing something across a room. If something is across the room, you can watch it. You can judge the distance. You can decide whether to run. You can try to understand what it is. But when it is behind you, your body has to choose between two terrible possibilities. You can turn around and confirm it is there, or you can stay facing forward and keep wondering whether it is still standing over you. I did not want to turn around. I remember feeling completely frozen for a moment, looking at the TV screen and trying to make sense of the reflection. Maybe it was a coat. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe I was seeing some object in the room from a strange angle. But it did not look like an object. It looked like a creature. It looked like something with a face. And it looked like it was watching me. I finally turned around. There was nothing there. Nothing. The space behind me was empty. No tall figure. No animal. No person. No shape standing in the room. The living room looked exactly the way it had always looked. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made the fear worse. Because I had seen it. I knew I had. I had seen the reflection in the TV screen, and I had turned around fast enough that I expected something to still be there. But there was nothing. I stood there staring at the empty room, trying to understand what had just happened. Then I looked back at the television. The screen was still dark. I expected to see it again. I expected the werewolf-like figure to still be in the reflection, maybe behind me, maybe standing in the same spot. Part of me almost wanted it to be there, because then at least I would know I had not imagined it. But the reflection was normal. Just the room. Just me. Nothing behind me. I checked again. Nothing. I moved slightly, trying to see whether there was a shadow or piece of furniture that could have made the shape. I looked at the angle of the room. I looked at what was behind me. I looked at the lighting. Nothing explained it. There was nothing in the living room that looked like a werewolf. There was no coat rack in the right place. No hanging jacket. No large stuffed animal. No person-shaped object. No open doorway making a strange silhouette. Nothing. I remember checking the house after that. Not because I was calm enough to make a proper plan, but because I needed to know whether I was really alone. I had already known I was alone, but after seeing that reflection, I needed to confirm it again. I looked around. I checked the front door. Locked. I checked the back door. Locked. The alarm was still set. Nothing had been opened. Nothing had been moved. There was no sign that anyone had entered. I remember standing in the house and feeling trapped by the fact that everything was secure. Normally, locked doors and an alarm are comforting. They mean nobody can get in. They mean you are safe. They mean your parents made sure the house was protected before leaving. But after what I saw, the locked doors became part of the problem. If nothing could get in, then what had been standing behind me? That was the question I could not answer. I was 9 years old, so I did not have mature explanations ready. I did not think about visual perception, reflections, shadows, sleep deprivation, memory errors, or the way the brain can sometimes turn incomplete images into recognizable shapes. I only knew that I had turned off the TV. I had looked into the black screen, and I had seen a werewolf standing behind me. I do not remember whether I called my parents right away. I may have called someone. I may have stayed near the phone. I may have turned every light on in the house. I may have sat in one room and waited until somebody came home. I know I did not want to be alone after that. Even if I acted normal, even if I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I would have been listening to every sound in the house. Every floorboard creak would have made me jump. Every small noise from the refrigerator or air vent would have made me look over my shoulder. When you are a child, fear can make a normal house feel completely unfamiliar. A room you have been in every day of your life can become threatening because you are suddenly aware of all the spaces you cannot see. The hallway, the doorway, the room behind you, the dark reflection in a window, the corner where the light does not reach. You start noticing places where something could stand without being seen. You start imagining movement in every shadow. You start thinking that the house is not really empty just because you cannot see anyone. I remember being especially afraid of the TV after that. When a television is on, it is bright. It fills the room with moving pictures and sound. It feels harmless because you are looking at it directly. But when it is off, the screen becomes a mirror. At night, it can reflect the room behind you more clearly than you expect. You can see yourself, the furniture, and whatever is standing near the wall or doorway. After that experience, I did not like looking at a dark television screen. Even now, decades later, I sometimes feel uncomfortable when I see my reflection in an off TV. It is not that I expect to see the same thing again. I do not walk into every room thinking there is a creature behind me. But the memory comes back quickly. I will catch sight of the black screen, see the room reflected behind me, and for 1 second, I am 9 years old again. I am standing in the living room. My parents are at work. The house is locked. The alarm is set. And something is standing behind me in the reflection. My heart rate still goes up when I think about it. That is the strange thing. I can tell the story now. I can say it happened decades ago. I can explain that I was a kid, alone in the house, and probably more easily frightened than I would be today. But my body still reacts to the memory. I still get that rush in my chest. I still feel the urge to look over my shoulder. I still remember how real it looked in that moment. I have tried over the years to come up with an ordinary explanation. Maybe it was a reflection of something in the room that my mind turned into a werewolf shape. That is probably the most likely answer. A dark TV screen reflects more than people realize. Depending on the lighting, objects can layer over one another in strange ways. A lamp can create a shadow. A doorway can line up with furniture. A jacket, a plant, a chair, or something hanging in the room can become distorted in the glass. Maybe there was an object behind me that for 1 second looked like a tall animal-like figure. Maybe I saw a reflection from another window. Maybe the lighting was low enough that my mind filled in the missing details. That is how the brain works sometimes. It is built to recognize faces and familiar shapes quickly. We see faces in clouds, faces in patterns on walls, faces in shadows, faces in the grain of wood. We see figures in dark corners because the mind would rather make a mistake than miss a possible threat. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe I saw a strange reflection, and my frightened 9-year-old brain decided it was a werewolf. That explanation makes sense, but it does not fully remove the feeling, because I remember the figure too clearly. I remember it standing behind me. I remember the sense of height. I remember the head shape. I remember the animal-like face. I remember how close it seemed. And I remember turning around and seeing an empty room. It would be easier if I had only seen a vague shadow. It would be easier if I had looked into the screen for half a second and thought something seemed wrong. But that is not how I remember it. I remember seeing a figure, then nothing. There were other strange things around that time in my life too. Other moments that felt wild and spooky. Things I have never fully explained. I do not want to get into all of them now, because each one is its own story. But they made this incident harder to dismiss. If this had been the only strange thing that happened to me, maybe I would have forgotten it. Maybe I would have written it off as a childhood imagination problem. Maybe I would have told myself it was a weird angle in a reflection and left it there. But other things happened. Not always big things. Not always clear things. Sometimes just noises, feelings, moments where a room felt wrong, or something happened that made me question whether I was truly alone. I do not know whether they were connected. I do not know whether I was simply more anxious at that age. I do not know whether being alone in the house made me more alert to small details that other people would ignore. Maybe I was just a kid with a strong imagination. That is possible. Children have vivid imaginations. They can turn ordinary shapes into monsters. They can remember fear in a way that makes an event grow larger over time. A strange moment can become sharper every time you replay it, but I do not think I invented the whole thing. I do not think I made up the feeling of seeing something in that reflection. I remember being afraid before I had time to tell myself a story about it. The fear came first. The explanation came later. I remember the exact panic of knowing I was supposed to be alone. That was what made it so unsettling. If my parents had been home, I might have thought one of them was behind me. If friends had been over, I might have assumed somebody was playing a joke. If the doors had been unlocked, I might have worried there was an intruder. But my parents were at work. I had confirmed I was alone. The doors were locked. The alarm was set. There should have been no one else in the house. And yet, in the dark reflection of the television, something was standing close enough to touch me. I think that is why the memory stayed. It was not just the creature-like face, it was the impossible location. Behind me, inside a locked house, in a room where I had just been sitting peacefully by myself. Years later, I still sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had not turned around. Would it have stayed there in the reflection? Would it have vanished anyway? Would I have seen it move? Or would I have realized after a few seconds that it was only a shadow? I will never know. I turned around as soon as I could. I saw nothing. Then I checked the TV again and saw nothing there either. That was the end of the event. Nothing jumped out. Nothing touched me. Nothing spoke. Nothing followed me through the house. There was only that one reflection, that one moment. But sometimes a single moment is enough. You do not need a long haunting, a dramatic attack, or a clear explanation for something to stay with you for decades. Sometimes all it takes is turning off a television. Sometimes all it takes is seeing a shape in the black screen. Sometimes all it takes is realizing that whatever you saw was standing directly behind you. I still do not know what it was. Maybe it was a trick of light. Maybe it was a reflection I misunderstood. Maybe it was fear and imagination working together. Maybe it was something I will never have a proper explanation for. But I know this much. I was 9 years old. I was alone in a locked, alarmed house. I turned off the TV. And for 1 second, in the reflection, I saw what looked like a werewolf standing behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there. Even now, decades later, my heart races when I remember it. I was home alone one afternoon while my wife was out somewhere. It was winter, so the whole house was shut up tight against the cold. The doors were closed. The windows were closed. The heat was running on and off in that quiet way it does during the colder months, and the house had that sealed-in feeling where every little sound seems louder because there is no fresh air coming through. I was in the kitchen doing something ordinary. I do not even remember what now. I may have been putting something away, making food, or cleaning up after myself. It was one of those slow, uneventful afternoons where nothing should have happened. Then a fly came in from the hallway. At first, I barely paid attention to it. Flies are annoying, but one fly in a house is not especially strange. Even in winter, one can get inside somehow. It may have been hiding in a warmer part of the house, near a vent, in an attic space, or somewhere I would never think to look. It buzzed around my head and kept circling the kitchen. I remember being irritated more than anything. It was one of those flies that seemed determined to get in your face. It kept coming too close, circling the light, then buzzing past my ear. I tried waving it away, but it came back. After a minute or two, I grabbed whatever was closest. I think it was a spatula, but I honestly cannot remember for sure. It was something flat and solid enough to swing. The fly passed in front of me again. I swung. I hit it hard, and 2 flies went flying across the room. I stopped. For a second, I thought I had seen it wrong. Maybe the first fly had been near another one. Maybe there were 2 flies in the same spot, and I had only noticed one because it was the one buzzing closest to me. That seemed possible. It was strange, but not impossible. I watched them land or disappear somewhere near the other side of the kitchen. Then another fly buzzed near me. I swung again. This time I made contact. And again, more than one fly seemed to go across the room. That was when I started paying attention. It was not just that I was seeing flies in the kitchen now. It was the way they seemed to multiply. Every time I hit one, there appeared to be more. I would swing at a single fly, hear the soft smack of the spatula connecting, and then see 2 or 3 small dark shapes scatter away. At first, I kept trying to reason with it. Maybe there had been a small group of flies in the room already, and I was only now noticing them because I was moving around and swinging at them. Maybe they had been resting somewhere near the ceiling. Maybe they had gathered near the light because it was warm. That would make sense. Flies are attracted to lights. They can hide in places people do not notice. They can get into wall spaces, vents, and light fixtures. A kitchen has plenty of small places where something could be hiding. But then I looked toward the ceiling light. The globe around it had broken some time before, so it was just a bare bulb in the socket. The light made a bright glare against the ceiling, the kind that makes it hard to focus on exactly what is around it. and some of the flies seemed to be coming out of that glare. That was the part that got to me. They did not look like they were simply flying toward the light. They looked like they were appearing from the bright area around it, dropping or moving out of the glare and into the kitchen. I remember standing there with the spatula in my hand, staring upward. A fly would circle, then another, then several. I swatted one, more scattered. I kept trying to tell myself it was normal. Maybe they had been sitting above the fixture. Maybe the warmth from the bulb had drawn them into a hidden space. Maybe the sound and movement of me swinging had disturbed them. But the more I tried to make sense of it, the more flies there seemed to be. Some came from the hallway through the open kitchen door. Others appeared from somewhere else in the house. A few seemed to move in from the direction of the ceiling light. The kitchen began to fill with them. At first, it was maybe 10 or 15 flies, then 20, then more. They were everywhere. They buzzed around the light. They crossed the room in short, frantic lines. They landed briefly on cabinets, walls, the window, and the counter. They flew close to my face. They bumped into the light. They seemed to appear from every direction at once. I started swinging more aggressively. I swatted at them with the spatula, then sprayed when I found something to spray. I killed a few. Then more came. I hit another one, more scattered. I tried opening space around me, moving from one side of the kitchen to the other, but the room did not feel big enough anymore. It began to feel like I was standing in a cloud of flies. That may sound exaggerated, but that is honestly how it felt. There were so many buzzing around that the sound itself changed. One fly makes a thin, annoying noise. 10 flies make a louder nuisance. But once there are dozens, the sound becomes a constant hum, a vibrating layer of noise in the room that you cannot ignore. It was not just a few bugs anymore. It felt like something had opened up inside the kitchen and released them all at once. I remember the exact thought that crossed my mind. This is like a horror movie. That was the moment the situation stopped being irritating and became frightening. I was alone in the house. It was winter. The doors and windows were shut. I had no idea where they were coming from. And every time I hit one, more seemed to appear. I started trying to find the source. I looked around the ceiling fixture. I looked toward the open doorway. I looked at the cabinets and corners of the room. I checked the window. Nothing seemed obvious. There was no broken screen, no open door to the outside, no large gap in the wall, no visible nest or cluster, no pile of flies in one place that would explain why they were suddenly everywhere. I kept swatting. I kept spraying. I killed dozens of them. They landed on the counter, the floor, and the sink area. Some dropped into the basin. Some ended up against the cabinets. I was moving fast, not thinking clearly, just reacting. I wanted them out of the kitchen. I wanted the buzzing to stop. The longer it went on, the more upset I became. I am not normally someone who panics easily. At least, I did not think I was. But there is something about being alone and having a normal room suddenly become full of hundreds of insects that makes your mind go to strange places. I began wondering whether there was something wrong with the house. Maybe something had died inside a wall. Maybe there was a nest somewhere. Maybe the ceiling fixture was connected to a hidden space full of them. Maybe the heat had brought them out. Maybe the entire house was full of flies, and I had only found the first wave. The worst part was that I could not stop them. Every time I made progress, there seemed to be more. At one point, I was standing there with the phone in one hand and the spatula in the other, trying to explain to my wife what was happening. I called her because I did not know what else to do. I remember saying something like, "There are flies everywhere. I don't know where they're coming from." Even as I was saying it, I knew it sounded ridiculous. How do you explain that you are terrified of flies without sounding completely insane? But it was not one fly. It was not 10. By then, it felt like there were a couple hundred in the kitchen. They were buzzing around the light, around my head, over the counter, through the open doorway, and around the ceiling. I had killed so many that I had started dropping them into the sink because I did not know where else to put them. My wife later told me she had never heard me so upset. I think that is true. I was trying to stay calm, but my voice must have sounded completely different. I remember pacing between the sink and the doorway. I remember swatting at things I could barely see. I remember feeling like the kitchen was no longer my kitchen. It had become a room full of movement, a room full of buzzing, a room full of tiny black shapes coming from places they should not have been able to come from. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. That is what still bothers me. The flies did not slowly die off over the next few days. They did not spread into the rest of the house. They did not gather around windows trying to get out. They did not continue appearing from the ceiling light. They simply disappeared. The ones I had not killed flew out through the open kitchen doorway and into the rest of the house. I expected them to show up in the hallway, living room, bedrooms, or bathroom. They did not. I expected to find them on windowsills later. I did not. I expected dead flies in other rooms. There were none. The only dead flies I found were the ones I had killed in the kitchen and dumped into the sink. The whole episode lasted maybe 10 or 15 minutes. That was it. 10 or 15 minutes from the first annoying fly to a kitchen full of buzzing insects to nothing. By the time my wife came home, the house was quiet again. The kitchen looked mostly normal, except for the sink. I had put all the dead flies there because I needed proof for myself. I knew how ridiculous the story sounded. I knew that if I had told someone afterward that hundreds of flies had suddenly appeared in the kitchen and vanished again, they would probably assume I was exaggerating. But there they were. Dozens and dozens of dead flies in the sink. My wife saw them. She was blown away by how many there were. That is the only reason I can say with confidence that I did not imagine the entire thing. I may not know where they came from. I may not understand why they appeared so quickly or why they vanished so completely after leaving the kitchen. But the dead flies were real. My wife saw them. She saw how many I had killed. She heard me on the phone while it was happening. Something bizarre had taken place. I have tried to come up with explanations over the years. The most reasonable possibility is that there was a hidden cluster somewhere in or near the kitchen. Maybe they had been dormant in a wall, attic, vent, ceiling space, or light fixture. Maybe a warm day, the heating system, or the bare bulb caused them to emerge. Maybe the glare around the ceiling light made it look like they were appearing from nowhere when they were actually crawling or flying out of a gap I could not see. Maybe there was some hidden opening near the light fixture. Maybe they had been trapped in a part of the house and found a way into the kitchen all at once. That is possible. There are plenty of strange things houses can hide, but the speed of it still feels wrong to me. The way they seemed to multiply when I swatted them. The way the room went from one fly to dozens, then to what felt like hundreds. The way the survivors flew through the kitchen doorway and then seemed to disappear into the rest of the house without leaving any trace. It all happened so fast, and it happened in a house that already had a strange history. We used to call the house haunted. I do not know whether I truly believe that word, but it was the easiest one to use. There had always been little things, sounds when nobody was nearby, smells that came and went without a clear source, the occasional feeling that a room was not empty when it should have been. There had also been a few full-body apparitions, or at least figures that people in the house thought they saw. A boy, a cat. Nothing that ever seemed threatening, nothing that ever attacked anyone or made us fear for our safety. Most of the time, the strange things were interesting. A little unsettling, maybe, but interesting. They made you pause and wonder. The fly incident was different. It was not interesting while it was happening. It was terrifying. There is nothing mystical or elegant about a room full of flies. It is not like seeing a shadow in a hallway or smelling perfume when no one is around. It is loud, physical, disgusting, and impossible to ignore. I was not standing there thinking about ghosts. I was trying to stop an insect swarm from taking over my kitchen. I was trying not to lose my mind. Afterward, I checked the house as best I could. I looked around the kitchen. I looked near the light. I checked the walls and cabinets. I looked through the rest of the house for dead flies or live ones. Nothing, no cluster in the hallway. No flies gathered in the windows, no buzzing cloud in another room, no sign that they had spread anywhere. It was as though the kitchen had briefly become the only place in the house where they existed. Then it was over. Even now, I barely like talking about it because it sounds unbelievable. I can imagine someone reading it and thinking there had to be a normal explanation. Maybe there was, and honestly, I hope there was. I would rather believe there was a hidden opening in the ceiling or an unnoticed insect cluster than believe something impossible happened. But I have never found the answer. No one ever found a nest. No one ever found a dead animal in the walls. No one ever found a gap around the light that explained it. No later infestation happened. No second swarm ever came. The house went back to being the house it had always been. Quiet, strange in small ways, but normal enough most of the time. Still, I remember that afternoon. I remember the winter light outside. I remember the house being closed up. I remember the first fly buzzing in from the hallway. I remember swinging the spatula and seeing more than one fly fly across the room. I remember looking up at the bare bulb and watching dark shapes move out of the glare. I remember calling my wife because I was so upset I did not know what else to do. And I remember the silence afterward. The kitchen empty again. The flies gone. The sink full of proof that for 10 or 15 minutes, something truly bizarre had happened in that room. I still do not know what it was, but I know I never looked at a single fly in the house the same way again. Oh my God, this story is so creepy that I still do not like telling it. Me, my brother, my sister, and my father have all always felt like there was something in my parents' house. Not all the time. Not in some dramatic movie way where objects fly across rooms every night, or people are constantly being chased by something unseen. Most of the strange things were small. A noise in another room. A smell that came out of nowhere. The feeling that someone had walked past a doorway when nobody was there. Sometimes people in the family saw things too. Not vague shadows every time, but shapes that looked human. The kind of experiences that you could almost dismiss if only one person had them. But when 4 people in the same family have different moments in the same house over the years, you begin to wonder whether the place has its own strange atmosphere. We never agreed on exactly what it was. Maybe it was an old house making old house noises. Maybe it was stress, exhaustion, or imagination. Maybe everyone was influencing everyone else after the first strange story got told. Or maybe there was simply something about that house that made people feel watched. Whatever it was, I had my own experience one night that I still cannot get out of my mind. I was at my parents' house with my son. He was asleep upstairs. I remember that clearly because part of what scared me was knowing that I was responsible for him. When you are alone in a house, you can convince yourself that a strange noise is nothing. But when your child is sleeping nearby, every unusual feeling becomes sharper. You become more alert. You listen harder. You do not want to overreact. But you also do not want to ignore something that might matter. It was late enough that the house had become quiet. The lights were mostly off. The rooms had that dim, familiar nighttime look, where furniture becomes dark shapes and every hallway seems longer than it does during the day. I came down the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, I made a left toward the kitchen. That was when I felt it. The air felt bizarre. That is still the best word I can use for it. I did not feel a cold spot exactly. It was not like a breeze came through the house, and it was not the ordinary coldness that comes from a draft or an open window. It felt like I had walked into a cloud of weird electricity, like the air had become heavy and charged. It was not something I could see, but I could feel it against my skin. The whole space around me felt different from the rest of the house. My body reacted before I had any reason to be afraid. I slowed down. I remember standing there for a moment, half in the hallway and half near the kitchen entrance, trying to understand why I suddenly felt uncomfortable. The kitchen was dark. There was just enough light from elsewhere in the house to make out the counters and the general layout, but not enough to see every detail clearly. I had been in that kitchen countless times. I knew where everything was. I knew the entrances, the pantry area, the refrigerator, the counters, the drawers. It was my parents' kitchen. It should have felt familiar. Instead, it felt wrong. Not haunted in some obvious way, just wrong. There was a pressure in the room, like the air had become too thick to move through easily. I walked in anyway. I needed something from the kitchen. I do not remember exactly what it was now. Maybe I was getting water. Maybe I wanted a snack. Maybe I was checking something before going back upstairs. I opened the refrigerator door because the light inside would give me enough brightness to see what I was doing. The refrigerator light came on. The cold white light spilled across the counter and the floor in front of me. It did not brighten the whole kitchen, but it gave me a small pocket of light while the rest of the room stayed dim. I started moving things around on the counter. Maybe I was looking for a drink. Maybe I was grabbing food. I was focused on what I was doing, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had followed me into the room. Then I heard whispering. It came from the pantry area. That was the direction I had just come from. At first I did not understand what I was hearing. It was not a clear sentence. It sounded angry, low, fast, whispering voices, or one voice whispering in a way that sounded like more than one person. It was not loud enough for me to make out words, but it had an unmistakable emotional tone. It sounded angry. I stopped moving. The refrigerator door was still open beside me, throwing light across part of the kitchen. The pantry area remained mostly dark. I listened. The whispering continued for a second or two. Maybe it was longer. Time gets strange when you are scared. A few seconds can feel like a full minute because your mind is searching every sound for meaning. I took one step forward, and as I did, I felt something move past me. Not a person brushing against me, not a visible shape crossing the room, more like a sudden push of energy, a pressure moving through the air from one side of the kitchen to the other. At the same moment, the refrigerator door slammed shut. Hard, the light disappeared. The kitchen went almost completely dark. I froze. It was one of those moments where your body reacts before you can reason through anything. My heart jumped. My knees felt weak. I remember standing there in the dark, trying to tell myself the door must have swung shut on its own. Maybe the refrigerator had been open at an angle. Maybe I had bumped it. Maybe the hinge had pulled it closed. Maybe the air pressure in the room shifted somehow. There are normal explanations for a refrigerator door closing. I know that. But the timing was what terrified me. I heard angry whispering. I stepped forward. I felt something rush past me, and the refrigerator door slammed shut. The darkness came all at once. For a second, I could barely breathe. I stood there, trying to see. There was a little bit of light coming from somewhere else in the house, enough to keep the room from being completely black, but not enough to make me feel safe. The pantry area was a darker shape within the darkness. I remember staring toward it. I did not want to turn my back on it. At that point, I was genuinely frightened. Not nervous, not curious. Frightened. I had always heard stories about that house. I had heard family members talk about strange sounds or unexplained things. I had always tried to be practical about it. I had told myself that houses make noise. People mishear things. Lights and shadows play tricks on the eyes, and memories become bigger after you tell them enough times. But standing in that kitchen, I did not feel practical. I felt like something was there with me. Then, I felt it in my gut. I cannot explain it better than that. It was not a thought. It was not a sound. It was a sudden certainty, deep in my stomach, that I was not alone. Something was behind me. At the other entrance to the kitchen, a voice said, "Hey." It was clear, not a whisper, not a sound I had to strain to understand. It was a voice the way a person would speak if they were standing right beside you trying to get your attention. Hey, my knees nearly gave out. I felt them weaken underneath me. I did not scream. I do not even remember whether I turned around right away. I think I stood there for a moment, completely shocked, because the voice sounded so normal. That was part of what made it terrifying. It was not some dramatic growl. It was not a scream. It was not a whisper from a horror movie. It was just hey, a simple word. The kind of thing somebody says when they know you. The kind of thing someone says when they want you to turn around. And I had the horrible feeling that whatever was there knew me. I know that sounds insane. I know how it sounds when you say it out loud. A heavy room, angry whispering, a refrigerator door slamming, and then a voice saying hey from behind you. It sounds like something made for a scary story. But it happened. At least something happened that night that I have never been able to fully explain. I did not stay in the kitchen. I got out of there. I do not remember every step of leaving. I remember wanting to get back upstairs to my son. I remember wanting lights. I remember wanting a door between me and that kitchen. I remember checking on him. He was asleep. The house looked normal again. That almost made it worse. The refrigerator was closed. The counters were still there. The pantry was still dark and quiet. Nothing jumped out. Nothing followed me upstairs. Nothing made another sound. But once you hear a voice in an empty room, the room does not feel empty anymore. For a long time after that, I hated being in the kitchen alone at night. I would walk through it quickly. I would turn lights on before entering. I would avoid looking toward the pantry when I passed it. I would remember the strange heaviness in the air and the way my body seemed to know something was wrong before anything happened. I never told the story easily. I did not want to sound crazy. I did not want people to say I was tired, imagining things, or trying to make a normal event sound supernatural. I knew there were other possibilities. The whispering could have been a sound from outside, a television in another room, water moving through pipes, or some strange echo from the house. The refrigerator door could have shut because of a faulty hinge, or the way I opened it. The feeling of something passing me could have been a draft, a shift in temperature, or my own adrenaline. The hay could have come from somewhere else entirely. Maybe a neighbor outside. Maybe a television. Maybe someone speaking in another room and the sound carrying through the house. All of that was possible. But the voice sounded close. Too close. It came from behind me at the other entrance to the kitchen. And the way it said hey made me feel like it was speaking directly to me. Years passed. Life moved on. My son got older. The kitchen remained the kitchen. My parents continued living there. The house continued to have its strange reputation among us. There were still little moments here and there, stories that would come up during family conversations, things someone heard or saw and could not fully explain. but I did not expect the same thing to happen again. Then, about 4 years later, my son was a teenager and staying at my parents' house. One evening, we were walking together when he said, "I need to tell you something, and I don't know if you're going to believe me." The way he said it immediately made me pay attention. He did not sound like he was joking. He sounded nervous. I asked him what happened. He told me that one night, when he had been alone in the house, he came downstairs into the kitchen. There was only a little bit of light. He was standing there doing something ordinary, maybe getting a drink, maybe checking his phone, maybe making food. He did not think much about it at first because it was his grandparents' house, and he had been there many times. Then he heard a voice behind him. It came from one of the entrances to the kitchen, and it said, "Hey." That was it. One word. "Hey." I remember stopping when he told me. For a moment, I did not know what to say. I had never told him the full story of what happened to me in that kitchen. I may have mentioned that the house felt strange sometimes, but I did not sit him down and explain the whispering, the refrigerator door, or the voice behind me. He did not know that I had heard the exact same word from the same general area of the room years earlier. He told me the voice sounded clear. He told me it sounded like someone was standing behind him. He turned around. No one was there. The kitchen was empty. I tried to stay calm while he explained it. I did not want to scare him more than he already was. I did not want to tell him immediately that I had experienced something similar, because I knew what that would do. Once you connect your own fear to someone else's, the story becomes heavier. But inside, I felt that same cold feeling all over again. Because the word was the same. Hey, not a name, not a whisper, not a bang or a knock, just hey. I asked him exactly where he had been standing. He told me. I asked which direction the voice came from. He pointed toward the entrance. The same entrance. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe that kitchen had strange acoustics. Maybe sound from another room traveled in a way that made voices seem close. Maybe people outside had spoken near an open window. Maybe the refrigerator, the pantry, and the two entrances created an echo that made ordinary sounds seem like they came from right behind someone. Maybe the house itself had a sound that the brain turned into a voice. That would be an explanation. But it was difficult to hold on to that explanation when I remembered my own experience. I remembered the heavy air. I remembered the angry whispering from the pantry. I remembered the refrigerator door slamming shut just as I felt something pass me. And I remembered the clear voice behind me saying, "Hey." My son did not report the same whispers or the fridge door. His experience was simpler. But the part he did experience was the part that had stayed with me for years. That one word. I did not tell him everything right away. I think I said something like, "I believe you." That was all he needed in the moment. He had been worried I would laugh at him or tell him he was imagining things. He was a teenager, and he knew how strange the story sounded. He did not want to be treated like he was making it up. I believed that he heard something. I did not know what it was, but I believed that he heard it. Afterward, I thought about my own experience again. I thought about how strange it was that I had felt. In that moment, like whatever was in the kitchen knew me. At the time, that feeling was almost more frightening than the voice itself. It was not logical. I knew that. It was just a gut reaction, a sense that I was not hearing a random sound, but being addressed. Then, years later, my son heard the same word in the same house. Maybe it was only a coincidence. Maybe both of us were tired. Maybe both of us were alone in a dim kitchen and more alert to every small noise. Maybe the house had a particular sound that, in certain conditions, resembled a person saying, "Hey." Maybe memory made the similarity stronger after the fact. I do not know. But I do know that I never felt afraid of that house in the same way before that night. I had heard stories. I had seen family members react to strange things. I had noticed weird smells and unexplained sounds. But I had never felt so clearly that something was standing behind me. The kitchen was always the worst place after that. During the day, it was normal. Sunlight came through. People made coffee, cooked food, talked, opened the refrigerator, and moved around. It was just a kitchen. At night, it was different. The pantry area looked darker. The entrances seemed wider. The refrigerator light seemed too bright when it opened and too sudden when it shut. And every time I stood there alone, I found myself listening, not because I wanted to hear anything, because I was afraid I would. I never got a clear answer. Nothing was captured on camera. Nobody found a hidden speaker. No one discovered a strange vent that made a voice-like sound. No one proved there was a person entering the house. There was only the story. My story. Then my son's. And the fact that, for years, several people in my family had felt that something in that house was not quite right. Maybe it was all ordinary. Maybe old houses collect sounds, smells, shadows, and memories in ways that make people uneasy. Maybe family stories made us more willing to notice strange things. Maybe once one person says a house is haunted, everyone starts looking for proof. That could be true. But I still remember my knees almost giving out. I still remember standing in the near darkness after the refrigerator doors slammed shut. I still remember feeling that impossible certainty that I was not alone. Then the voice behind me. Hey, plain as day, as loud as a person standing beside you. And years later, hearing my son say the exact same word had been spoken to him in that same kitchen. That is why I still do not like telling the story, because I can explain the sounds, I can explain the door, I can explain the heavy air as fear, stress, or a change in temperature, but I still cannot explain why that house seemed to say the same thing to both of us. Hey. Before the next story begins, thank you for staying here in the dark. If this is your first visit, subscribe to Wickless Night for more true stories made for the late hours, when the world is quiet and every little noise feels important. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has made you look around the room so far. Now, let's continue. Myself and a few other members of my family have always been what people would probably call sensitive. I have had a lot of weird experiences since I was a kid. Some of them were small things that were easy to ignore, like feeling that someone was standing in a room when I was alone, hearing a familiar voice when nobody had spoken, or having a strong sense about something before I had any normal reason to know it. Other things were harder to explain. When I was young, I saw figures that I thought were ghosts. I would sometimes know the names of people who had died without understanding where the information had come from. I had moments where I said something that made adults look at me strangely because I should not have known it. Most of the time, though, it was not dramatic. It was just odd. It was the kind of thing that made you pause, then keep going with your day. My family was used to strange stories. Some people in the family had their own experiences. Some believed in spiritual things. Some did not. Some preferred not to talk about it at all. For me, most of it was manageable. Even when something felt unusual, it was rarely frightening. I had learned to live with the feeling that not every strange moment would have an answer. Sometimes it was a noise. Sometimes it was a shadow. Sometimes it was a feeling that passed once I turned on a light or walked into another room. But I had a few experiences that genuinely scared me. The worst happened about 5 years ago when I was 23 and caring for my mom. My mom had alls. Even now, it is difficult to explain what that time was like without making it sound too simple. ALS is a terrible disease. It slowly takes away a person's ability to move, speak, breathe, and do the things that used to be automatic. It does not happen all at once. It happens in pieces. First, something becomes difficult. Then something else. Then another part of life becomes a task that needs help, equipment, planning, and constant attention. By that point, my mom was attached to a breathing machine and needed 24-hour care. Everything in the house revolved around keeping her safe. There were medications, equipment, schedules, food preparation, check-ins, alarms, battery backups, appointments, and the constant fear that something could go wrong when everyone was already exhausted. You never fully relaxed. Even when things were quiet, you listened for the sound of the ventilator. You watched for changes in her breathing. You noticed whether her shoulders were tight, whether she seemed uncomfortable, whether something needed to be adjusted, whether a machine made a noise that it should not have made. The nights were often the hardest. Night shifts could be brutal. You would be tired before the shift even began, then spend hours waiting for the next thing that needed attention. It was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was just checking tubes, adjusting pillows, warming food, keeping things clean, trying to make sure my mom was as comfortable as possible. But the exhaustion built up. When you are caring for someone who needs constant help, sleep starts to feel like a luxury. You learn to take it whenever you can. A few uninterrupted hours can feel like a gift. One of my mom's nurses was a complicated person. I do not say that lightly, and I do not mean she was purely bad. She helped us at a time when we desperately needed help. Staffing was difficult. Finding people who could work the hours, knew what they were doing, and were willing to come into a high-stress home care situation was not easy. We were grateful for anyone who could show up and give us some relief. But this nurse had a destructive side. She brought a lot of chaos with her. There were things about her life and behavior that made everyone uneasy. She could be difficult, unpredictable, and emotionally intense. Still, in the situation we were in, we did not have the freedom to be picky. The nurse would sometimes bring her granddaughter to work with her. The girl was around 9 or 10 years old. I will call her Cindy. That was strange to me from the beginning. It was not really a place for a child. The house was full of medical equipment and stressful routines. My mom's condition was serious. There were long, quiet periods, but there were also moments where things needed immediate attention. It was not the kind of environment where a child should have had to sit for hours at a time, but again, the situation was messy. We needed help. The nurse needed to work, and Cindy was sometimes there. At first, Cindy seemed like a normal kid, quiet sometimes, distracted by her tablet, drawing pictures, wandering near her grandmother, watching television. She was the kind of child who could be in the same room as adults for a long time without saying much, then suddenly start talking about something completely unrelated. One night, she was drawing. I noticed the picture because it gave me a strange feeling. It showed Cindy floating above her bed, not lying in bed, not dreaming. Floating, her body was up against the wall or above the bed in a way that did not look playful. It was not a picture of a superhero flying. It was darker than that. The way she had drawn it made it look like she was being held there or stuck there. I commented on it. I asked her what it was supposed to be. That was when she started telling me about a bad thing that came to her at night. She talked about it in the straightforward way children sometimes talk about things that frighten them. There was no dramatic build-up, no attempt to scare me. She just said that something would come and hurt her. I asked what she meant. She described being lifted up at night, or clawed. She used words that suggested something was grabbing or pulling at her while she was in bed. She talked about being moved or raised in a way that made the drawing suddenly feel less like an odd picture and more like a record of a fear she carried around with her. I remember feeling uneasy immediately, but I did not jump to a supernatural explanation. I knew enough about children to understand that they can describe fear in unusual ways. They may turn nightmares into stories. They may draw things that look frightening because they are processing stress. They may use words like monster or bad thing when they are trying to describe something emotional they do not have the language for. I also knew that children can be exposed to things they should not be exposed to. They can go through difficult situations and explain them in ways adults do not fully understand at first. They can have vivid imaginations, but they can also be trying to communicate something real without knowing how. So I listened. I asked a few gentle questions. I tried to understand whether she was talking about dreams, nightmares, a person, or something else. But she did not give me an explanation that made me feel better. She just repeated that a bad thing came at night. Later that evening, we were all in the living room. The nurse was asleep on the couch. She had passed out completely, the way people sometimes do when they are exhausted and have been up too long. The television was on, low enough that it was more background noise than anything else. Cindy was sitting nearby with her tablet, watching something or playing a game. My mom was in her usual place with her equipment around her. I was sitting close to her, tending to her shoulders. Because she could not move the way she used to, tension would build up in her body. Her shoulders would become extremely tight, and I would massage them to give her some relief. It was one of those small caregiving tasks that became part of daily life. I knew where the tension gathered. I knew how much pressure she could handle. I knew that even a little comfort mattered. The room was dim except for the TV and a few lights. It was quiet. The nurse was asleep. Cindy was absorbed in her iPad. My mom was resting as much as she could. I was focused on her shoulders. Then I looked up. Behind Cindy, standing on the couch, there was something. At first, I could not make sense of it. It was not a clear figure. It did not look like a person standing there in the normal way. It looked like heat rising from a road in the summer, that shimmering distortion you see above pavement, where the air seems to ripple and bend whatever is behind it. But this distortion had shape. It was loosely gathered into something that looked human, tall, maybe 6 feet. It stood behind Cindy on the couch, not touching the floor, not leaning against the wall, just appearing as a figure in the space behind her. The outline shifted slightly. It was not solid enough for me to see a face or clothing, but it had the general form of a person. A head, shoulders, a body. Something standing upright where nothing should have been standing. I stared at it. I remember thinking that it had to be a trick of light. Maybe the television was reflecting in a window. Maybe the angle of a lamp was distorting something. Maybe I was exhausted and my eyes were struggling with the low light. But then I saw what it was doing. It looked like it was touching the top of Cindy's head, not holding her roughly, not visibly hurting her, but resting something like a hand against the top of her head. That made every part of me go cold. I thought about the drawing. I thought about what Cindy had told me earlier. The bad thing, the lifting, the clawing. I did not know what I was seeing. I did not know whether it was real, whether I was overtired, or whether my mind was connecting things that did not belong together. But I did know that I did not want it near her. In the past, I had felt like I had interacted with things that seemed negative or threatening. I had learned, at least in my own mind, to focus on them, to look directly at them, to refuse to let fear take over. So I concentrated on the figure. I focused all my attention on it. I did not say anything aloud. I did not want to frighten Cindy or wake the nurse. I just stared. I tried to direct everything in me toward the thought that it needed to leave her alone. I watched it. The shimmering shape stayed there. Then, slowly, it seemed to turn its attention toward me. That was when the room changed. I began to feel extremely warm. Not comfortably warm. Not like the heat had turned on. It felt like heat rising from inside my body. Like I was suddenly sweating. Like the air around me had become too close. I remember my skin feeling hot. My face, my neck, my arms. I kept looking at the figure, but I was starting to feel uncomfortable. My thoughts were racing. I was trying to keep one hand on my mom, stay calm for Cindy, and make sense of something I could not explain. Then the microwave went off. The sound cut through the room. I had been warming some of my mom's food. Because she ate through a gastric tube, her feedings had to be prepared carefully. We mixed bags of food with butter and other supplements, warmed what needed warming, and made sure everything was ready before feeding her. The microwave beeping was normal. But in that moment, it felt like an interruption that gave me permission to move. I got up and went into the kitchen. The kitchen was dimmer than the living room. The microwave light was on, and there was a small amount of light coming from other areas of the house, but most of the room was shadowed. I opened the microwave or turned toward it. Then I saw something in the corner of the bathroom. It looked exactly like Cindy. At first, my mind went to the simplest explanation. Maybe Cindy had walked into the kitchen without me noticing. Maybe she had gone into the bathroom. Maybe I had been so focused on my mom and the strange figure that I had lost track of where she was. But the shape in the bathroom corner did not move like Cindy. It was facing the wall, standing very still. The height looked right. The outline looked right. From behind, it looked like a child in the same general shape and size as her. I said her name, or at least, I think I did. There was no response. Then the figure started to turn toward me. The way it turned was wrong. That is the only word I have for it. It was not like someone turning their head and shoulders normally. It was like its face bent around toward me at an angle that did not make sense. Like the mouth stretched around the side of its face. Like its features were being pulled or rearranged as it slowly turned. I could not understand what I was seeing. I remember the shape of the face changing. I remember a sense that it was trying to become something else as it looked at me. For a few seconds I stood frozen in the kitchen. Then the power went out. Everything shut down at once. The microwave, the lights, the house. A sudden whoosh of darkness. For most people, a power outage is annoying. For us, it was a disaster. My mom depended on her ventilator. The machine had a battery, but it would only last a few hours. We had a backup system, but even with the backup, we could only maintain her breathing machine for around 7 hours total. There was no time to stand in the kitchen and be afraid. The second the power went out, every strange thought left my mind. I sprang into action. I got focused on the generator. I checked the backups. I checked the equipment. I made sure my mom was safe. That was all that mattered. The fear was still there somewhere, but caregiving takes over in moments like that. You do not get the luxury of panicking when someone else's life depends on you being useful. I remember the nurse waking up. I remember the house being dark. I remember people moving quickly, speaking in urgent voices, trying to get everything functioning again. I remember the generator process, the equipment, the heavy feeling of knowing that every minute mattered. Nothing else happened that night. At least, nothing strange. The power came back on after about an hour. No one ever gave me a clear explanation for why it went out. Maybe it was a neighborhood outage. Maybe something tripped. Maybe there was an issue outside the house. Power can fail for ordinary reasons. And sometimes it comes back without anyone knowing exactly what caused it. But it happened at the exact moment I saw that figure in the bathroom turn toward me. That coincidence stayed with me. After that night, I only saw Cindy one more time. I do not know what happened in her life. I do not know whether anyone ever understood the things she talked about or the pictures she drew. I do not know whether she had nightmares, trauma, a vivid imagination, or something else entirely. I hope she was okay. That is what I think about most now. At the time, I was scared by what I saw. I was scared by the shimmering figure behind her. I was scared by the way it seemed to rest a hand on her head. I was scared by the thing in the bathroom that looked like her, but moved in a way that did not seem human. But underneath that fear was concern. She was a child, and she had told me something was hurting her at night. I still do not know what to make of that night. I do not know whether exhaustion played a role. I was 23 years old, sleeping badly, carrying a huge amount of responsibility, and living in a constant state of alert because of my mom's condition. I was often awake at strange hours. I was emotionally drained. I was worried about my mom all the time. Those conditions can affect the mind. Stress can make shadows look like figures. Lack of sleep can make ordinary things feel unreal. A TV reflection, a dim room, a child's movement, and the brain's tendency to recognize patterns could have created something that felt completely real in the moment. Maybe the figure behind Cindy was light and heat distortion from the television. Maybe the shape in the bathroom was a shadow, a reflection, or a moment of mistaken perception. Maybe the power outage was only a power outage. I know all of that. I also know that, in that moment, it did not feel like nothing. It felt like something was in the room, something that had heard Cindy, something that turned toward me when I tried to focus on it, something that I could not explain. And then the lights went out. That night scared the shit out of me. Not because I can prove there was anything supernatural happening, not because I know what the figure was, but because I was exhausted, trying to keep my mom alive and comfortable, trying to protect a child who seemed afraid of something she could not explain, and suddenly found myself staring at things that did not fit into any ordinary explanation I had. Then the house went dark, and I had to choose between fear and responsibility. I chose responsibility, but I have never forgotten what I saw before the power went out. When I was a child, I was outside alone in our backyard. I was probably around 6 or 7 years old at the time, old enough that my parents were comfortable letting me play outside by myself for a little while, but still young enough that the backyard felt like its own whole world. It was completely fenced in, the gates locked from the inside, so I knew I was safe. At least, that was the feeling I had back then. The backyard was familiar. It was a place where I played, climbed around, made up games, and spent time when the weather was nice. There were no strangers, no cars, no busy road, no place for anyone to come in unnoticed. It was just our yard. We had a swing set, and that was usually where I went first. I loved the swing set. It was one of those simple things that can entertain a child for a long time. You could sit there and push yourself back and forth, higher and higher if you felt brave, watching the sky appear above you each time you leaned back. Sometimes I would pretend I was flying. Sometimes I would just swing quietly and listen to the sounds around me. I remember that day being normal when I first went outside. The yard looked the way it always did. The fence was around me. The house was behind me. There were probably trees nearby, maybe the sound of wind moving through leaves, maybe birds somewhere farther away. We lived near mountains, so there was always a feeling that the world stretched farther beyond the neighborhood than it did in other places. But inside the backyard, everything felt small and safe. I sat on the swing and started moving myself back and forth. At first, I was not swinging very high. I was just using my feet to push against the ground, then lifting them and letting the swing glide forward, back and forth, back and forth. The chains made that familiar soft sound. The ground moved beneath me. The sky appeared each time I leaned back. I do not know how long I had been sitting there when I saw the shadow. It passed over the yard suddenly. At first, I thought it might have been a cloud. Sometimes clouds move in front of the sun and make the whole yard darker for a second. But this was not like that. This was a distinct shadow, dark and sharp enough that it looked like something large had moved directly overhead. The ground beneath me changed color for a moment. The swing set seemed darker. The grass looked darker, and before I had time to understand why, I looked up. There was a huge bird flying over the backyard. It was low, much lower than any bird I had ever seen fly over the house before. It did not look like a small bird crossing high above the trees. It looked close enough that I could make out the shape of its body, close enough that I could see the wings spread wide across the sky. It was completely black, not dark brown, not gray, not a bird with black markings. It looked black from wingtip to wingtip. The wings were enormous. Even now, I remember feeling like they had to be at least 7 or 8 feet across. Maybe I was wrong about the exact size. I was only a child, and judging distance or wingspan from below is difficult. A bird flying low can look much larger than it really is, especially when you are 6 or 7 years old and looking up at something against a bright sky. But it looked huge. It looked bigger than anything I had seen flying before. The bird crossed over the yard in a way that made it feel almost silent at first. I do not remember hearing the normal flutter of wings. I do not remember hearing a cry or any sound that told me what it was. I only remember the shadow, then the black wings, then the head. The head was the detail that stayed with me most. It was shaped like an egg. That is the only way I can describe it. It was not like the sharp hooked head of an eagle that I had seen in pictures. It was not like the narrow head of a hawk. It did not look like a normal bird head to me at all. It looked smooth, rounded, almost too large for the body from the angle I saw it, like an egg sitting at the front of a huge black shape. The bird moved over me so quickly that I did not have time to study it. I did not stand there calmly trying to identify wing shape, feather pattern, or beak. I was a little kid on a swing, and something enormous had passed low above my head. I felt scared immediately. Not the kind of fear that builds slowly. It was instant. The way your stomach drops when something surprises you and your body decides, before you can think, that you need to get away. I jumped off the swing and ran inside. I do not remember stopping to look back. I do not remember waiting to see where it went. I just ran toward the house. I remember getting inside and feeling relief the second I was behind a door. The backyard suddenly did not feel safe anymore. It had been fenced in. The gates had been locked. I had been alone but comfortable. Then that thing flew over. After that, the yard felt exposed. It felt like being outside meant something could come down from the sky without warning. I never went into that backyard alone again. At least, not in the same way. I might have gone outside with family. I might have played there when other people were around. But I did not want to sit alone on the swing anymore. I did not want to be in the middle of the yard with nothing above me except open sky. That sounds dramatic now, but when you are a child, fear can change a place very quickly. One moment, a swing set is fun. The next, it is the exact place where you saw something that should not have been there. For a long time I tried to make sense of what I had seen. Because we lived near mountains, I thought maybe it was some kind of vulture, eagle, hawk, or other large bird of prey. That was the explanation that made the most sense to me. Maybe it had been a vulture circling lower than usual. Maybe it had been an eagle coming down through the area. Maybe it was a bird I had never seen before. And because I was young, the size and shape had looked more frightening than they really were. That explanation helped a little. It was better than thinking I had seen something impossible. But even then, I could not stop thinking about the head. The body and wings might have been explained by a large bird. There are birds with huge wingspans. There are vultures, eagles, condors, and other birds that can look enormous from below. But I could not match the head to anything I knew. It was not simply round, it was egg-shaped, smooth-looking, almost featureless from where I stood. Maybe the sunlight had made it look that way. Maybe the bird was turning its head, and I only saw it from a strange angle. Maybe feathers were flattened by wind. Maybe it was too far away for me to see the details, and my mind filled in the missing parts. But I remembered it clearly enough that it stayed with me. At that time, there were no computers in our house, no Wi-Fi, no quick way to type a description into a search engine and look through photos. I could not ask a phone what bird had black wings and an egg-shaped head. I could not pull up a field guide online. I could not watch videos of local birds or compare silhouettes. So, I just kept the memory in the back of my mind. I thought that someday, when I was older, I would try to figure out what it was. I told myself there had to be an answer. There had to be a bird that matched what I saw. Maybe it was rare. Maybe it was only found near mountains. Maybe it was some strange kind of vulture I did not know about. Years passed. The memory did not fade the way most childhood memories do. Usually things from when you are 6 or 7 become blurry. You remember the general feeling of a place, but not the exact day. You remember playing outside, but not what you were wearing. You remember a house, but not the way the sun looked on one particular afternoon. This memory stayed sharp. I could still picture the swing set. I could still picture the fence. I could still picture the huge shadow moving over the grass. And I could still see that black bird above me. Eventually, when I was older and could search for things online, I tried to look it up. I searched for black birds with large wingspans. I searched for birds near mountain areas. I searched for vultures, eagles, ravens, condors, and anything else that could possibly fit. Then I searched more specifically for a black bird with an egg-shaped head. Nothing looked right. There were birds that were black. There were birds that were large. There were birds with unusual silhouettes, but I never found one that looked like what I remembered. That did not mean there was no explanation. It may simply mean that I did not know how to describe what I saw well enough for a search engine to help. I was describing a moment from childhood. I had no photograph, no exact location, no date, no way to know how high it was flying, and no way to judge whether my memory had changed over time. A bird could look completely different from below than it does in a wildlife photograph. A bird could look black in shadow, even if it was actually dark brown. Its wings could look larger because it was flying low. Its head could look smooth and egg-shaped because the light was behind it, making the actual features impossible to see. All of that is possible, but I still could not find anything that gave me that feeling of recognition. Nothing made me say, yes, that was it. Then, much later, my mom told me something strange about the house. Apparently, before my family lived there, the house had been abandoned for around 10 years. I had not known that as a child. To me, it was just our house. It was where we lived. It was where I played in the backyard. It was where my room was, where my family ate meals, where normal life happened. But according to my mom, The house had sat empty for years before we moved in. She also said people had creepy stories about it, not just about the house itself, but about other odd things that had happened in the neighborhood. I do not know every detail of those stories. I do not know how much was rumor, how much was memory, and how much grew over time as people talked about the past. There were no stories about the bird specifically. No one said they had seen a giant black bird with an egg-shaped head over the yard. No one had a local legend that explained it. No one told me there was some known creature in the area. But learning that the house had been abandoned for so long, and that other people had unsettling experiences connected to it, made the memory feel different. Before that, I had thought of the bird as one strange moment in my childhood. After that, I started wondering whether there was something about that house or neighborhood that had always felt off. Maybe there was not. Maybe people only connected things after they heard a story about an abandoned house. That happens all the time. A house has a strange history, and suddenly every creak, shadow, and bad feeling becomes part of a larger mystery. I know that. I know how easy it is for people to link unrelated events together. The bird could have had nothing to do with the house. It probably had nothing to do with the house. It could have been a real animal that passed over the yard once and never came back. It could have been a large bird moving through the area. It could have been something rare or unfamiliar, or simply something I misjudged because I was young and scared. But I still remember it. It has been around 15 years now. That is a long time to carry one image in your head. I can still remember the feeling of sitting on the swing by myself. I can still remember the sudden shadow. I can still remember looking up. And I can still remember how my fear did not come from seeing a normal bird. It came from the fact that it looked wrong. Too big. Too black. Too low. The head too smooth and strange. The whole thing had a shape that my mind could not fit into anything familiar. I did not think it was a monster at the time. I did not stand there and decide I had seen something supernatural. I was too young to think in those terms. I just knew I was scared, and I knew I wanted to get inside. That was enough. Sometimes I wonder whether the memory has become stronger because of how afraid I was. Fear can make small things feel huge. A bird with a 6-foot wingspan could become an 8-foot wingspan in the memory of a child. A dark head could become an egg-shaped face. A brief second could become a longer moment, because fear slows everything down. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe I saw a large vulture or eagle from an angle that made it look unusual. Maybe the light made its feathers look completely black. Maybe it had a rounded head, and I only saw it in silhouette. That is the explanation I try to hold on to. But even with that explanation, I still get chills when I think about it. Because I did not just see it from far away. It flew low enough to cast a shadow over the yard. It flew low enough that I could see the shape of its head, and it appeared over me while I was alone, sitting on a swing inside a fenced backyard where I thought nothing could reach me. I never went back into that yard alone after that, not because I believed the bird would come back, not because I thought something was waiting for me, but because that one moment changed the way I looked at the sky. Before that, the sky was open space. Afterward, it felt like something could be in it, something huge, something dark, something that could pass over you without warning. Even now, years later, I can hear the swing chains in my mind. I can picture the grass beneath my feet. I can picture the fence around the yard. Then the shadow moves over everything. I look up, and there it is. A massive black bird with wings that seem too wide for the space above me and a head shaped like an egg. Then I run. I still do not know what it was. Maybe I never will, but I remember it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. When I first moved into the room, I did not think there was anything unusual about it. It was a student room in halls, the kind of place that felt temporary from the beginning. The walls were plain, the furniture was basic, and everything had that slightly worn look of a room that had belonged to dozens of people before you and would belong to dozens after. There was a bed, a desk, a wardrobe, and the usual small things that made it possible to live there while studying. Nothing about it stood out. Nothing felt strange during the day. In daylight, it was just a room. At night, it slowly became something else. The first time I noticed anything odd, I was half asleep. I had been lying in bed under my duvet, tired from classes and whatever else I had done that day. I was at that point where you are not fully awake, but not completely asleep either. The room was dark. The hallway outside was quiet. I could hear the normal sounds of people living in halls, a door closing somewhere far away, plumbing in the walls, muffled footsteps, someone laughing in another room before everything finally settled down. Then I felt my duvet move. At first, it was barely noticeable. I assumed I had shifted in my sleep and pulled it down myself. That happens all the time. You turn over, move your legs, and the covers slide toward the foot of the bed without you realizing. So I pulled the duvet back up. I did not think about it much. Then, a little later, I felt it again. This time, it was different. It felt like something was pulling at the duvet from the end of the bed. Not enough to rip it away, not enough to make me sit up immediately, but enough that I noticed the fabric tightening over my legs. It was a small tug, then another. It felt like someone had grabbed the bottom edge and pulled once, then let go. I remember lying still for a few seconds. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I was just on the edge of sleep and misreading the feeling of the blanket moving. Maybe my foot had caught underneath it. Maybe the mattress had shifted slightly. There were plenty of normal explanations. I pulled the duvet back up and went to sleep. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was more awake when I felt it. I had just drifted off when the blanket tightened over my legs. The fabric moved down toward the end of the bed. I grabbed it and pulled it back up, annoyed now more than frightened. I remember thinking that the bed must be the problem. Maybe the duvet was too smooth and kept sliding. Maybe the mattress had a slope I had not noticed. Maybe I moved more in my sleep than I realized. It was easy to explain if I wanted it to be easy. But after a few nights, I started to notice another feeling. Sometimes, instead of the duvet moving, it felt like there was weight at the foot of the bed. It was not a heavy, crushing weight. It was more like someone had sat down near the end of the mattress. The bed would dip slightly, and the covers would pull tighter around my legs. That feeling is difficult to ignore. You know what your own bed feels like. You know the difference between turning over and someone else putting weight on the mattress. Even if you cannot prove it, your body notices. The first few times, I would open my eyes and look toward the foot of the bed. There was never anything there. The room was dark, but not completely black. I could see the outline of the desk, the wardrobe, maybe a little light from the hallway under the door. The end of the bed was empty. Every time I would stare for a few seconds. Then I would tell myself I was being stupid. I was tired. I was stressed. I was living in an unfamiliar room, in a building full of noises, surrounded by people I did not really know yet. It was normal to sleep badly. It was normal to hear things. It was normal for your mind to turn small physical sensations into something more frightening when you were alone at night. That was what I told myself. But the feeling kept coming back. It happened over several nights. At first, it was just a small tug on the duvet. Then it became more deliberate. The cover would pull down farther than before. I would wake up with my legs partly uncovered and find myself clutching the duvet, trying to pull it back over me. Sometimes, as soon as I pulled it up, I would feel another tug from the bottom. It was not violent at first. It was almost testing, like something was checking whether I would react. Then it became more aggressive. One night, I woke up because the duvet was being pulled down hard enough that I had to grip it with both hands. I remember the feeling of the fabric tightening in my fists. I remember being fully awake, lying in the dark, pulling back against something I could not see. I did not hear footsteps. I did not hear a door open. I did not hear anyone enter the room. There was no sound except the quiet rustle of the blanket moving. I sat up and looked around. Nothing. The door was closed. The room was empty. The window was shut. There was no one standing at the end of my bed. Still, I barely slept afterward. Once you have felt something pulling at your bedding in the middle of the night, the room does not feel the same. You start watching the shadows. You notice every small movement of fabric. You become aware of the distance between your head and the door, the end of the bed and the wall, the dark corner near the wardrobe. You start wondering whether you are awake enough to trust your senses. I had heard of sleep paralysis before. I knew that people can wake up unable to move and see strange things. They can feel pressure on their chest, sense a presence in the room, hear voices, or see figures near the bed. I had never experienced anything like that clearly before, but I knew it was a real sleep-related phenomenon. So I started telling myself that was probably what was happening. Maybe I was half asleep when I felt the duvet move. Maybe I was having vivid dreams that blended with waking up. Maybe the weight at the end of the bed was a strange sleep sensation. Maybe my brain was trying to explain normal physical feelings in the scariest way possible. That seemed reasonable, but each night, the experiences felt more physical. The duvet would pull, the bed would dip. I would lie awake afterward, heart racing, trying to stay still because I did not want to make anything worse. I started sleeping with the covers tucked more firmly around me. That did not help. I started leaving a light on sometimes. That did not help either. The room never looked unusual when I checked. The light only made it easier to see that there was nothing there. And somehow, that was worse. It was easier to be afraid of a dark room. Darkness gives you an explanation for what you cannot see. But when the room is lit enough to show that nobody is there, and you still feel something tugging at the bed, you are left with very few explanations that feel comforting. One night, things reached a point that I still think about years later. I had gone to bed as normal. I was tired, probably too tired. The kind of tired where your body aches and you just want to shut your eyes and disappear for a few hours. I pulled the duvet up and got comfortable. I remember lying on my side. At some point during the night, I felt the usual tugging at the end of the bed. The duvet slid down. I pulled it back up. Then it happened again. This time, more forcefully. The cover dragged down over my legs, and I grabbed it quickly. I pulled it back toward my shoulders and held it there. I remember feeling annoyed and frightened at the same time. I was exhausted, but I was also fully alert now. I rolled over, and right in front of my face was a pale white face of a man. I do not know how long it had been there. I do not know whether it was standing beside the bed, leaning over me, or somehow appearing in that moment. I only know that when I turned, it was close enough that I could see it clearly. It was pale, the kind of pale that did not look like normal skin in a dark room. It looked drained of color, white against the darkness. I remember the face more than the body. I remember the closeness. I remember looking straight into it. For 1 second, I could not move. I did not scream right away. I did not leap out of bed. My whole body went still because my brain could not accept what I was seeing. Then I blinked. Or maybe I pulled back. Or maybe the figure was gone before I could react. I do not remember every detail after that. because fear made everything blur together. I remember sitting up. I remember turning on a light. I remember looking around the room. Nothing, no man, no open door, no sign that anyone had been there. The room was exactly as it always was. That was the night everything stopped. There were no more hard tugs on the duvet after that. No more sensation of weight at the foot of the bed. No more waking up feeling like someone was sitting near my legs. No more pale face close to mine. It was as though whatever had been happening had built toward that one moment and then ended. For a while I tried to dismiss it completely. I decided it had been sleep paralysis. That was the explanation I gave myself, because it was the only explanation I could live with. I had been tired. I had been stressed. I was living away from home. I was sleeping badly. Maybe I had woken in the middle of a dream and seen something my brain created. Maybe the duvet sensations were part of the same thing. Maybe I had rolled over at the wrong moment, half asleep, and my mind turned a shadow into a face. That happens. People see things in dark rooms. People wake up disoriented. Sleep can make ordinary sensations terrifying. I told myself all of that. And for a while it worked. The experiences had stopped. Nothing else happened in the room. I went back to classes, back to normal routines, back to treating the room like a place to sleep rather than a place I needed to fear. Then, a few weeks later, I got to know the night guard. He had been a student at the university before taking the job. He was around the halls often, and over time we talked more. He was easy enough to get along with. He knew the building, knew the students, and understood the strange rhythm of halls at night. There is something about night staff in student accommodation. They see things everyone else misses. They walk the quiet corridors after everyone has gone to bed. They hear the building settle. They deal with people who are drunk, upset, locked out, sick, homesick, or just wandering around at 3 a.m. This guard had that kind of calmness. He seemed older than he probably was because he had been through a lot. One night, we shared a drink. I asked him why he had quit university. I did not mean it in a rude way. I was just curious. He had been a student, then suddenly he was working night shifts in the same halls. It seemed like there had to be a reason. At first, he gave a simple answer. He said his friend had died the year before, and he needed a job to cover his expenses until he could rejoin the following year. That was sad, but it did not immediately connect to me. I expressed sympathy, and we kept talking. As the night went on, he got more emotional. Maybe it was the drink. Maybe it was the fact that night shifts are lonely. Maybe he had been carrying the grief around without many people asking about it directly. Eventually, he told me more. He said his best friend had died during term break. He said his friend had taken his own life. Then he told me one of the reasons he had become friendly with me was because his friend had died in my room. I do not remember what I said immediately. I think I just stared at him. The words did not fit into my head at first. My room. The room where my duvet had been pulled down night after night. The room where I had felt someone sitting at the end of the bed. The room where I had rolled over and seen a pale man's face directly in front of mine. I had spent weeks trying to convince myself it was sleep paralysis, and now I was sitting across from someone telling me that his best friend had died there. I did not know whether to believe him completely. I still do not know every detail of what happened in that room before I moved in. I do not know whether the university had told anyone. I do not know whether the story was known among staff or whether it had been kept quiet. I do not know whether the guard had heard it from someone else or had been directly involved in the aftermath. I only know that he believed it. He was emotional when he said it. He was not trying to scare me. He did not seem pleased to be telling the story. He looked like someone talking about something painful that he had tried not to think about for too long. And suddenly, The pale face I had seen felt impossible to dismiss. That does not mean it was a ghost. I still understand that sleep paralysis is a possible explanation. I was tired, stressed, and sleeping in an unfamiliar room. The mind can create incredibly vivid experiences. It can make a sensation of bedding shifting feel like someone pulling it. It can make a mattress dip feel like someone sitting down. It can create faces and figures in the dark. The human brain is good at finding meaning in fear. And after hearing the guard's story, it would have been easy for my mind to connect everything. Maybe I had already heard rumors without realizing it. Maybe something about the room made me uneasy, and my imagination took over. Maybe the guard's story made a vague memory become more dramatic afterward. All of that is possible, but the timing still bothers me. The experiences happened before he told me. I did not know the room had that history when I felt the duvet being pulled. I did not know anyone had died there when I saw the pale face. I had no story to attach to it at the time. I only had fear. The strange thing was that the disturbance stopped after the face appeared. There was no long series of events afterward. No continued haunting. No escalating attacks. I did not hear voices. I did not see the face again. It ended. And then, weeks later, I learned what the night guard said had happened in that room. That information did not make me feel like I had solved anything. It made me feel sad. There was a person behind the story, a student, someone's best friend, someone who had been alive in that same room, with his own worries, his own life, his own people who cared about him. That was harder to sit with than any ghost story. I did not suddenly start thinking of him as a monster or something evil. I did not think the room was cursed. I did not imagine the pale face as something trying to hurt me. If anything, the story made the whole experience feel more tragic than frightening. Maybe what I saw was nothing more than a sleep-related hallucination. Maybe the man's face was a trick of fatigue and darkness. Maybe the bedding moved because I was restless. Maybe the bed dipped because of the mattress. Maybe the guard's revelation was only a coincidence that gave an ordinary experience a terrible context. But I still remember rolling over. I still remember that pale face in front of mine. I still remember the fear that went through me before I knew anything about the room. And I still remember the night guard sitting across from me, emotional and tired, telling me that his best friend had died there. The room never felt normal after that. I could still sleep in it, but I noticed things differently. I noticed how quiet it became at night. I noticed the shape of the bed in the dark. I noticed how close the walls felt. I noticed the silence after the hallway lights went out. But nothing else happened. No more tugging. No more weight at the end of the bed. No more face, just the memory. And maybe that is why it stayed with me. Not because I know for sure that something supernatural happened. I do not. But because for a brief period of time, I felt like I was sharing my room with something I could not see. Then I learned that someone had died there before me. Whether those two things were connected, I will probably never know. Tonight's stories are over, but darkness has a way of making memories feel closer. Some people never forgot what they saw. Others never learned what was behind the sound, the voice, or the shape waiting just outside the light. Tell me in the comments which story you will be thinking about after this ends. Subscribe to Wickless Night for more true accounts from the hours when no one wants to be awake alone. Sleep carefully, and do not trust every shadow that stays still.